You don't belong here. You never did. Those were the last words Sang-woo said to me, before two of his men escorted me out of the building like I was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. No raised voice, no visible anger. Just that flat, controlled tone he used when a decision had already been made, and there was nothing left to discuss. The kind of tone that left no room for argument, no space for explanation, no air at all. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I stood in the cold outside the Meridian Tower on Michigan Avenue, Chicago wind cutting through the thin fabric of my blouse, and I did not cry. I just stood there for a moment, the glass doors sliding shut behind me, watching my own reflection disappear as the lobby darkened on the other side. 3 months. That's how long I had worked inside that building. 3 months of arriving before sunrise, of learning which hallways to take and which ones to avoid, of understanding the unspoken rules that governed every floor, every room, every glance exchanged between men in expensive suits. 3 months of making myself invisible while somehow becoming necessary. And now, I was standing on the sidewalk at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, holding my tote bag and trying to remember how normal people breathe. It had started the way most things in my life start, without ceremony, without warning, almost by accident. I was a medical supply coordinator. That's the cleanest way to describe it. I worked for a mid-size logistics company out of the Loop, handling procurement contracts for hospitals and private clinics across the Midwest. It wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets and phone calls, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 8 hours negotiating prices on surgical gloves and IV tubing. But it paid well enough, and I was good at it, and for a long time that felt like enough. The contract with Meridian Health Partners came through my company in late January. On paper, it looked like a standard deal. A private healthcare investment group needed a third-party coordinator to manage supplies for 4 affiliated clinics in the Chicago area. My supervisor handed it to me because I had the cleanest track record, and because, as she put it, this client does not like complications. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. My first day at the Meridian Tower, I noticed things that didn't quite fit. The lobby had no reception desk, just a man in a dark suit who looked at me for 3 full seconds before letting me through. The elevators required a key card that had been left for me in an envelope with no return address. The office I was given on the 14th floor was clean, well-lit, and completely isolated from the rest of the floor's activity. My laptop was already set up. My credentials were already loaded. Nobody introduced themselves that first week. People moved past my door like I was furniture, which honestly was fine. I've always worked better without an audience. It wasn't until the 3rd week that I saw him. I had stayed late, later than I should have, trying to reconcile a shipment discrepancy for one of the clinics in Evanston. The 14th floor was empty by then, or I thought it was. I stepped out to refill my water bottle and nearly walked directly into a wall of black fabric. I stepped back, looked up. He was tall for a Korean man. Not unusually so, but enough that I had to adjust my line of sight. Dark hair pushed back from his face. A suit that looked like it had been constructed specifically around his body. And tattoos. I noticed those immediately, crawling up the side of his neck from beneath the collar of his white shirt, intricate and dark against his skin. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the phone in his hand, and when he finally glanced up, his expression didn't change at all. That was the first thing I noticed about Sang-woo. Not the tattoos, not the suit, not the 2 men who materialized from somewhere behind him the moment I appeared. It was the stillness of his face. Like whatever reaction lived inside him had been locked behind something very deliberate. He looked at me for 2 seconds. Then he looked at the man to his left and said something in Korean, very quietly, and kept walking. I stood in the hallway for a moment after they disappeared around the corner. My heart was beating faster than the situation warranted. I told myself it was just the surprise of nearly colliding with someone. I went back to my desk and finished the reconciliation report. The next morning, my access card had been upgraded. I didn't ask why. Over the following weeks, I started to understand the shape of the operation I had stepped into. Not through anyone telling me, because no one told me anything, but through the work itself. The clinics I was coordinating for weren't ordinary. The supply volumes were too high. Certain items moved in and out with a frequency that didn't match standard patient care cycles. There were specific delivery windows that had to be honored exactly. And if a shipment was even slightly off, I would receive a call from a number I never saved in my phone. A man's voice giving me precise instructions in accented English before hanging up. I'm not naive. I understood, gradually, that I was coordinating medical supplies for people who couldn't walk into a hospital. People who needed care managed privately, quietly, completely off any official record. The thing is, I was good at it. Maybe better at this than I had been at anything before. There was a clarity to the work that I hadn't expected. Every decision mattered. Every detail counted. There was no space for sloppiness, and I am, fundamentally, not a sloppy person. I told myself that what I was doing was essentially still healthcare logistics, that the supplies reached people who needed them, that I wasn't asking questions I didn't need to ask. I was aware that I was making compromises. I just hadn't yet understood the cost. The first time Sang-woo spoke directly to me was in the elevator, 6 weeks in. I had been called to the 22nd floor for the first time, a floor I hadn't known I had access to until that morning, when my keycard suddenly worked on a button I had been pressing by instinct for weeks without result. The meeting was brief, a review of a logistics adjustment for one of the clinics. There were 4 other people in the room, none of whom I recognized. Sang-woo sat at the head of the table and did not look at me once during the entire 30 minutes. When it was over and I was waiting for the elevator alone, the doors opened and he was already inside. I considered taking the stairs. I didn't. The doors closed. He was looking at his phone. I was looking at the floor numbers descending. 14 floors of silence. And then, without looking up, he said, "The Evanston Clinic is short on 2 line items this week." I kept my eyes on the doors. "I know. There's a delay with the distributor. I've already rerouted through a secondary supplier. It'll be resolved by Thursday." A pause. Then, Wednesday. "The secondary supplier's earliest window is Wednesday." Same tone. Flat, unhurried, final. The elevator opened on my floor. I stepped out without responding, because there was nothing to respond to. He had already looked back at his phone. I fixed the Evanston delivery for Wednesday. I don't know how I managed it. I called in 3 favors and had to personally drive to a warehouse in Cicero at 6 in the morning to make it happen. When I got to the office that day, there was a coffee on my desk. Black, from the good place on the ground floor, not the machine in the break room. No note. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then I sat down and got to work. That was the beginning of something I still don't entirely have words for. Not a relationship. That's not the right word. And it would be dishonest to use it. More like a gravity. A slow, persistent pull that I kept telling myself I wasn't feeling. Right up until the moment I couldn't pretend anymore. And now I was outside. Removed. Discarded. Efficiently. And without explanation. By 2 men in suits who had been polite about it in the way that made politeness feel like a threat. The Chicago wind pushed against me, cold and indifferent. I pulled out my phone and looked at it for a moment. No messages, no missed calls. Just the time. 9:17 a.m. I put it back in my bag. And then, because I didn't know what else to do, I started walking. I walked for almost 40 minutes before I realized I had no destination. That's the kind of thing you don't notice until your feet start to hurt. That you've been moving purely on instinct, letting the city carry you forward because stopping means thinking, and thinking means feeling. and feeling means admitting that what just happened actually happened. I ended up on the riverfront, standing near the railing on the riverwalk, watching the dark water move south while a group of joggers passed behind me like everything was completely normal. I suppose for them it was. I replayed it in my mind for the 100th time in 40 minutes. The way Marcus, one of Sang-woo's senior men, the one who always stood near the door during meetings, had knocked on my office door that morning. The way he hadn't quite met my eyes. The way he'd said, with that careful, rehearsed neutrality, that my services were no longer required at Meridian, that my contract had been fulfilled, that a severance package would be transferred to my account within 48 hours. I had asked why. He had said, "Mr. Yoon feels it's time to transition the role." Mr. Yoon, not Sang-woo. Mr. Yoon, like I was someone who had never sat across from him, never fixed an impossible delivery because he'd said one word and made it sound like gravity. Like the last 3 months had been purely transactional, and now the transaction was complete. Maybe that's exactly what it was. Maybe I had been the naive one, reading weight into silences that were just silences. I gripped the railing and exhaled slowly. The river didn't care. The city didn't care. And apparently, neither did Sang-woo. I spent the rest of that day doing practical things, because practical things have always been my way of managing the impractical. I called my supervisor at the logistics company and told her the Meridian contract had concluded. She seemed unsurprised, more unsurprised than I expected, and told me there was a smaller hospital contract in Indianapolis I could pick up if I wanted it. I said I'd think about it. I went home to my apartment in Pilsen, made rice and beans because it was the only thing in my fridge that hadn't expired, and sat at my kitchen table staring at the contract folder I'd kept on my laptop. All my records were clean. Every order, every delivery, every adjustment, documented with the same precision I brought to everything. If anyone ever looked at my work, they would find nothing out of place. That had been intentional. I had always known, somewhere in the careful back corner of my mind, that I needed to be invisible in a way that also meant being irreplaceable. You don't work in that kind of environment without developing a survival instinct, even when you're telling yourself you're just doing logistics. I closed the laptop. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my cousin Denise, who lived in Wicker Park, and who had no idea where I'd been working or what I'd been doing, and I asked if she wanted to have dinner. She said yes immediately, the way Denise always says yes to everything. And I felt something release slightly in my chest. Dinner with Denise was loud and warm, and full of her talking about her new job and a man she'd met at a pottery class, and I let it wash over me like something medicinal. I didn't tell her anything real. I laughed at the right moments and ordered a glass of red wine I barely touched and tried to remember what it felt like to exist outside of that building. It mostly worked. Until my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Chicago area code. I stared at it long enough that Denise noticed. "You gonna get that?" "No," I said, and turned the screen face down. But my heart had done something complicated, and I couldn't entirely undo it. When I got home that night, I checked the number. No voicemail, no text, nothing. I told myself it was nothing. A spam call, a wrong number, a coincidence. I lay in bed for 2 hours before I fell asleep, and even then, the sleep was shallow and full of images I couldn't hold. A hallway, an elevator, the particular weight of silence from someone who never needed to raise his voice to make the entire room adjust. 3 days passed. I started preliminary work on the Indianapolis contract. I ran in the mornings along the 606 trail, pushing myself harder than usual, grateful for the physical exhaustion. I bought groceries. I rearranged the books on my shelf. I did all the things a person does when they're trying to construct normalcy out of whatever's available. On the 4th day, I got a call from a woman named Janet Chu, who identified herself as a clinic administrator for Northside Care Partners, one of the 4 clinics I had been coordinating for through Meridian. She sounded tense in that way people sound when they've been told to call, but not exactly told what to say. "Ms. Reyes," she said, "I'm reaching out because we've had some significant issues with our supply chain since last week. There are critical items that were on standing order through your coordination that have now either disappeared from the system or been incorrectly rerouted. I was given your direct number and told you might be able to help resolve it." I sat very still at my kitchen table. "Who gave you my number?" A pause. I was just told to contact you directly. I'm sorry if this is irregular." It was more than irregular. It meant someone had given her my personal number after I had been removed from the contract. Someone who presumably still had access to my information. "What items are we talking about?" I asked, because even as my mind was doing several things at once, the logistics part of my brain had already engaged. She listed them. I recognized the standing orders immediately. I had set them up myself, calibrated to the specific and unusual needs of that clinic. Whoever had taken over my role had clearly not understood the system, or hadn't been given proper context for why certain orders were structured the way they were. "Give me 24 hours, I said, before I could think better of it. "Thank you," she said, with a relief in her voice that told me the situation was worse than she was letting on. I hung up and sat there for a moment, looking at nothing. Then I opened my laptop. I spent most of that night rebuilding the rerouting structure for Northside. It wasn't my responsibility anymore. I was fully aware of that. I had no contract, no authorization, no official reason to be touching any of this. But the work had a logic to it that I understood completely, and somewhere in the doing of it, I found something that felt uncomfortably like purpose. By 2 a.m, I had a resolution document drafted and sent to Janet Chu through a secure channel I still had access to because, apparently, someone had not revoked all of my credentials. That detail stayed with me. I closed the laptop and went to bed. The next morning, I found a note under my apartment door. Not a letter. Not an envelope. A single sheet of plain white paper, folded once, with nothing written on the outside. I stood in my doorway in my socks, holding it for a moment before opening it. Inside, in clean, minimal handwriting, "You fixed the Evanston problem in 14 hours. You have 48 to decide if you're coming back." No signature, no explanation. No acknowledgement of the fact that I had been removed without explanation 4 days earlier. I read it twice. Then I put it on my kitchen counter and made coffee, and stood there looking at it while the coffee brewed, trying to sort through what I was actually feeling. There was anger. Real, legitimate anger. The kind that had been quietly building since the moment Marcus had knocked on my office door with that rehearsed neutrality. There was something else, too. Something more complicated that I didn't want to name. The note didn't say, "Please." It didn't say I'm sorry, or there was a reason, or any of the things a reasonable person says when they've removed someone without explanation and then found that they needed them back. It said decide. Like the decision was mine to make. Like he was acknowledging, in the most minimal way possible, that I had standing here. That my leaving had created a problem his organization couldn't easily solve. I thought about the clinic in Northside. About Janet Chu's voice, that barely contained strain. About the other 3 clinics, and the people they served. People who couldn't access care anywhere else. I thought about what I had built inside that tower over 3 months. Not just the systems, but the knowledge. The particular, irreplaceable understanding of how those operations worked and why. And the way I had calibrated everything around. Needs that were never fully explained to me, but that I had learned to read anyway. I thought about Sang-woo, standing in that elevator, not looking at me when he said Wednesday. And then the coffee on my desk the next morning. I thought about the way a room changed when he entered it. Not loudly, just shifted, the way a magnetic field shifts metal without touching it. I picked up the note. I put it in my bag. I didn't decide anything yet, but I didn't throw it away either. I didn't go back the next day, or the day after that. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't some calculated move to establish leverage. It was simpler and more embarrassing than that. I was afraid. Not of Sang-woo, not exactly. Or at least not in the way that fear usually presents itself. It was more like standing at the edge of something and knowing that once you step forward, the ground behind you closes. There's no version of going back where you're still the same person who left. So I waited. I went for my runs. I worked on the Indianapolis preliminary documents. I cooked actual meals and called my mother on Sunday, and did not think about the note sitting in the front pocket of my tote bag. I thought about it constantly. On the third day, the day before the 48 hours would technically expire, though the note hadn't specified from when, I was at a coffee shop on 18th Street, laptop open, pretending to review procurement data, when someone sat down across from me without being invited. Not Sang-woo. I want to be clear about that, because my heart did something unreasonable for the half second before I looked up. It was a woman, Korean, maybe late 30s, with the kind of posture that suggested she had never once slouched in her life. She was wearing a gray coat and no jewelry except small pearl earrings, and she set her coffee cup down on my table like we had arranged to meet here. "Camilla Reyes," she said. Not a question. I closed my laptop halfway. "I don't know you." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "My name is Soo-yeon. I handle certain administrative matters for Mr. Yoon's organization." She paused, letting that settle. He wanted me to clarify something about the note. I kept my face neutral, which took more effort than it should have. "There's nothing to clarify. It was straightforward. He thought you might interpret it as an order." She tilted her head slightly. "It wasn't. He wanted you to understand that the position is genuinely yours to take or decline. No consequences either way." I looked at her for a moment. He sent someone in person to clarify that. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Mr. Yoon is aware that his communication style can be..." She seemed to choose the word carefully. "Terse." That might have been the understatement of the year. "Why was I removed in the first place?" I asked. I deserve an actual answer to that. Soo-yeon wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. For the first time, she looked something other than perfectly composed. Not uncomfortable exactly, but like she was navigating something with more weight than her neutral expression was letting on. "There was a concern," she said finally. "About your safety." I waited. "Someone outside the organization became aware of your role. The decision was made to remove you from visibility quickly." She met my eyes. "It was not a reflection of your work. Or of anything else. Or of anything else." I turned that phrase over carefully, examining it from different angles. "And now?" I asked. "Is the concern resolved?" "It's been addressed," she said, in a tone that made me decide I didn't want details. She left 10 minutes later, after we had exchanged exactly no personal information, and she had finished her coffee with the unhurried patience of someone who was never in a rush, because the world simply arranged itself around her schedule. I sat there after she was gone, staring at the condensation ring her cup had left on the table. A concern about your safety. Someone had noticed me. Someone outside the organization had looked in my direction. And Sang-woo's response had been to push me out, not to protect the operation, or not only that, to protect me. I pressed my fingers flat against the table. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. I went back the next morning. I didn't announce it. I didn't call anyone or send a message. I simply arrived at the Meridian Tower at 7:45 a.m., the same time I had always arrived, and walked through the lobby. The man in the dark suit looked at me, looked at something on the screen in front of him and stepped aside. My keycard still worked on the elevator. It still worked on the 14th floor. My office was exactly as I had left it, which was either practical or deliberate or both, and I had spent the walk from the parking garage convincing myself it didn't matter which. I sat down. I opened my laptop. I started working. Nobody said anything to me for the first 2 hours. People moved past my open door the same way they always had, with that practiced indifference that I had long since stopped reading as hostility. It was simply the ecosystem of the place. You existed within it, or you didn't. At 10:15, Marcus appeared in my doorway. He looked, for just a fraction of a second, genuinely surprised to see me, which meant my return hadn't been communicated to everyone, which meant Suyon's visit had been either unofficial or very quietly arranged. "Ms. Reyes," he said, recovering quickly. "Good to have you back." "The Northside Clinic needs a full system review," I said. "Whoever tried to manage my accounts last week created 3 overlapping orders that are going to result in a surplus of 1 item and a shortage of 2 others by Friday. I'll have a correction report by end of day." He nodded. "Of course." He left. I went back to the screen. I didn't see Sang-woo that day, or the day after. His absence had texture to it. That's the only way I can describe it. The building still operated with the same quiet efficiency, the same controlled movement, the same sense of weight pressing down from above. But he wasn't visible, and I found myself cataloging that fact with more attention than I wanted to admit. On my 3rd day back, I was called to the 22nd floor for a supply review meeting. 6 people around the table, 2 of whom I recognized from before. An empty chair at the head. We were 15 minutes in when the door opened. Sang-woo didn't look at me when he entered. He took the empty chair, accepted a tablet from the man to his right, and asked a question in Korean that one of the others translated efficiently. The meeting continued. I presented my correction report for Northside. I answered 2 technical questions. I kept my voice level and my notes precise, and I did not look at him any more than I looked at anyone else in that room. But I was aware of him the way you're aware of a change in atmospheric pressure. Not loud, just present. Unavoidable. When the meeting ended and people began to file out, I gathered my folder and stood. "Reyes." 1 word. My last name, the way he'd started using it around week 4 of the first time. Like my first name was something he'd decided to hold back. I stopped, and everyone else seemed to filter out with a sudden efficiency that told me this had been anticipated. I turned. He was still seated, the tablet face down on the table in front of him, looking at me with that expression I had spent 3 months trying to decode. Not cold, exactly. Not warm, either. Something measured, like he was calculating something I didn't have the variables for. "You came back," he said. "You asked me to." I kept my voice even. "And the clinics need continuity." Something moved in his expression, so brief I almost missed it. "That's the only reason?" It was the most direct question he had ever asked me. I felt it land somewhere in my chest and stay there. "Does it matter?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I had to resist the urge to look away, and then he said, "The person who noticed you. He won't be a problem anymore." I understood what that meant, and I chose not to examine it too closely. I figured. "You weren't supposed to know it happened. I'm observant," I said. "It's why you hired me." Another pause. He picked up the tablet. "Back to business, or the appearance of it. The Evanston Clinic needs a new standing order for the next quarter. I want your assessment by Thursday." "You'll have it Wednesday," I said. I watched the corner of his mouth shift, barely, almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. I left before I could read anything more into it. The next 2 weeks were, On the surface, identical to the 3 months before. I worked. I coordinated. I untangled the problems created by my brief absence and rebuilt the standing order structures more carefully than before, documenting everything in a way that was thorough, but that also, I'll admit, made the system somewhat more dependent on my specific understanding to operate correctly. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed of it either. What changed was subtler, harder to articulate. Sang-woo started appearing in places he hadn't before. Not conspicuously. Nothing he did was conspicuous. But I would be in the building's small kitchen on the 14th floor at 7 a.m., and he would come through for exactly the 2 minutes it took to collect something. And there would be that silence between us that had started to feel less like absence and more like a language I was still learning. Or I would be leaving the building late, and one of his men would materialize near the elevator to walk me to the lobby, always with some functional explanation. A package, a message, a form, that we both understood was not the actual reason. Once I was on the phone in the hallway, a difficult call with a supplier who was threatening to pull a contract, and I looked up to find Sang-woo standing about 12 feet away, not pretending to do anything else. Just there. When the call ended, he said nothing. He simply turned and walked back toward the stairs. I stood in the hallway for a moment afterward, my phone still warm in my hand. Possessive. That's the word that came to me. Slow and a little unsettling, like finding something unexpected at the bottom of a drawer. Not aggressive, not demanding. Just this quiet, absolute certainty that he knew exactly where I was at all times within that building, and possibly beyond it. I told myself it was professional, that I was a critical operational asset and it made sense to keep proximity. I'm not sure I believed that, even when I was thinking it. The thing about being watched over by someone who never admits that's what they're doing is that it gets inside your head in ways that are difficult to defend against. I started noticing the small things first. The way the difficult supplier who had been threatening to pull our contract suddenly called back 2 days later, completely compliant, with an apologetic tone that didn't quite match the aggressive posture of our last conversation. The way a man who had been loitering near my apartment building, someone I had noticed twice and told myself was coincidence, simply stopped appearing after the 3rd day. The way certain meetings I wasn't supposed to be included in started having my name on the calendar, quietly, without explanation, as though someone had decided I needed visibility in rooms I hadn't known existed. None of it was announced. None of it was explained. It simply happened, the way weather happens. You look up and the sky has changed without anyone asking permission. I should have been unsettled. In some rational, detached part of myself I was. But there was another part, quieter, more honest. The part that surfaces at 2 a.m. when you can't maintain the careful architecture of your own justifications. That felt something uncomfortably close to relief. That part scared me more than anything else. It was a Wednesday, 5 weeks after I'd come back, when everything shifted. I was in the middle of a routine review on the 14th floor when Soo-yeon appeared in my doorway. Not her usual composed entrance, but something slightly faster, slightly more deliberate. She closed the door behind her, which she had never done before. "There's a situation," she said. "Mr. Yoon needs you on 22. Now." I saved my file and followed her to the elevator without asking questions, because the particular energy she was carrying told me questions would slow things down, and slowing things down was not currently an option. The 22nd floor was different than I'd ever seen it. 3 additional men I didn't recognize stood near the windows. Marcus was on the phone in the corner, speaking low and fast. 2 laptops were open on the central table, both showing what looked like shipping manifests, the kind that moved through my systems, that I had built and managed for months. Sang-woo was standing at the far end of the room with his back to the door, looking out at the city. He turned when I entered, and something in his expression, that carefully calibrated stillness, had a different quality today. Tighter, controlled in the way that takes real effort. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He came to the table and turned one of the laptops to face me. On the screen was a supply order, one I recognized immediately because I had structured it myself. A specific procurement chain for the North Side Clinic that moved through 3 different distributors for reasons I had never been explicitly told but had always understood were about obscuring the final destination. Someone accessed this chain 3 days ago, he said. Modified 2 routing points. The modification is subtle enough that it wouldn't be caught in a standard review. I leaned forward, looked at the data. He was right. It was subtle. But I could see it immediately, the way you can see a wrong note in a piece of music you know by heart. Someone had redirected a secondary leg of the chain through a different warehouse, one that wasn't in my approved network. They weren't trying to steal the shipment, I said, mostly to myself. They were trying to track it. Silence in the room. I looked up. Sangwoo was watching me with that expression I still didn't have a clean translation for. That's what we think, Marcus said from the corner, phone lowered. The warehouse they rerouted through. Do you have an address? I was already pulling the second laptop toward me. Because if the modification was made 3 days ago and the shipment moved yesterday, there's a window where the tracking data would still be incomplete. They'd need a secondary confirmation point, which means I was already in the system, pulling thread after thread, following the logic of it the way I always followed logistics problems, backward from the anomaly to the origin. Here, this address in Bridgeport. The order was flagged for a delivery confirmation that doesn't match anything in my original structure. Someone added it. The room was very quiet. Sangwoo reached past me and looked at the screen. He was close enough that I could see the ink on the side of his neck in detail, the dense, layered work of the tattoos disappearing beneath his collar. And I focused very deliberately on the data in front of me. He straightened, said something in Korean. 2 of the men I didn't recognize moved immediately toward the door. Then he looked at me. You found that in 4 minutes. I built the system, I said. I know what doesn't belong in it. Something crossed his face that I didn't catch fast enough to name. He pulled out the chair beside me and sat down, not at the head of the table, but next to me, which was unusual enough that I felt Marcus register it from across the room. Walk me through the rest of it, he said. Everything that looks wrong. So I did. For the next hour and a half, I went through every active order chain across all 4 clinics, flagging anomalies, tracing modifications, building a picture of exactly how compromised the system was and where the access points had been. Sangwoo sat beside me the entire time, asking precise questions, making decisions in real time, a word here, a gesture there, and watching me work with an attention that felt different from professional observation. It felt like something he wasn't trying to hide anymore. By the time we finished, the room had thinned out. Marcus was gone. Suyeon had stepped out at some point. It was just the 2 of us and 1 man near the door, who had the particular quality of someone trying to be architecturally invisible. I closed the laptops and sat back. How bad is it? I asked. Manageable, Sangwoo said. Now. Because I found the modification. Because you built the system well enough that the modification was visible at all, he said. Someone else would have let it run. I looked at my hands on the table for a moment. There was something I needed to say, and I was deciding how directly to say it. This is the second time something has gone wrong in a way that connects back to me. The first time, you removed me. I need to know if that's still on the table, because if it is, I'd rather know now than it's not. No pause, no qualifier. I looked at him. The first time was a mistake, he said, in the same flat tone he used for everything, but with a weight underneath it that I felt rather than heard. I acted on incomplete information. From Sangwoo, I had come to understand that was as close to an apology as the architecture of him could produce. It wasn't nothing. It was, in its way, significant. Okay, I said. Okay, he repeated, and the word sounded different in his mouth, like he was trying the shape of the accommodation. The man near the door shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. Sang-woo glanced at him, and he immediately returned to stillness. I gathered my notes and stood. My legs were slightly unsteady from sitting tensed for 90 minutes, or from something else, and I was grateful that the table gave me a reason to move without it being obvious. Reyes. I stopped. Don't stay late tonight. He was looking at his phone now, in the way he looked at his phone when he was done with a conversation, but not done with a thought. The Bridgeport situation will be resolved by evening, but until then, I'll leave by 6, I said. A pause. 5. I almost said 5:30 just to see what would happen. I didn't. But I thought about it, which felt like a small, private act of resistance that I needed more than I could have explained. I left at 5. One of his men walked me to my car, casually, with the pretense of heading in the same direction. I drove home through the tail end of rush hour with the radio off, just the city noise and my own thoughts for company. I thought about the way he had sat beside me instead of across from me. The way he'd said it was a mistake with no softening, no performance, just the plain fact of it, offered without decoration, because decoration wasn't something he did. I thought about the coffee that had appeared on my desk in those early weeks, about the way a loitering stranger near my building had simply ceased to exist. I thought about Soo-yeon saying a concern about your safety, and what it had taken for a man like Sang-woo to make a decision that removed something functional and necessary from his operation because a threat had appeared near it. I pulled into my parking spot and sat in the car for a while without getting out. There was a word for what was building between us, and I had been refusing to look at it directly for weeks. Not because it wasn't real. I think I had known it was real since that elevator, maybe before, but because naming it would make it something that required decisions. And the decisions, in this context, were not small. Getting involved with someone like Sang-woo wasn't like getting involved with someone complicated. It was like choosing to live inside the complication, permanently, with no clean exit, and no pretending you didn't know what you were walking into. I knew what I was walking into. I got out of the car and went inside. That night I sat at my kitchen table and ate dinner, and didn't think about anything in particular. Just let the day decompress the way days do when you've been running on pure function for hours. But at some point, without quite deciding to, I found myself thinking about all 4 clinics, about the people they quietly served, about the specific and irreplaceable function that I had built into that system over months. And I thought, this matters. Not in the abstract, not as a justification, but as a real, grounded fact. What I did there mattered, in ways that my work had never quite mattered before. That was its own kind of trap. I understood that. I washed my dishes and went to bed and didn't lie awake for long. The Bridgeport situation was resolved by Thursday morning. I know this because when I arrived at the Meridian Tower at 7:50 a.m., the particular tension that had lived in the building's air for the past 2 days was simply gone. The men near the elevator were the usual ones. Marcus moved through the hallway with his normal measured pace, instead of that slightly accelerated version that meant something was being managed. Even the quality of silence on the 22nd floor felt different. Settled, rather than held. I didn't ask what had happened in Bridgeport. I had learned, over months, that there were categories of information that flowed toward me when they were relevant to my work, and that asking beyond those categories produced either silence or careful redirection. I had made a kind of peace with that boundary. The clinics were intact. The supply chains were clean. Whatever had needed to be resolved had been resolved, in the quiet and total way that Sang-woo resolved things. I fixed the remaining anomalies in the system before noon. I rebuilt 2 of the routing chains entirely, this time with an additional layer of verification that would make unauthorized modifications visible within hours rather than days. I documented the architecture in a way that was thorough, and also, deliberately, written in a logic that would take someone else considerable time to fully inhabit. I'm still not entirely proud of that. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't do it. What I didn't expect was the phone call at 2 p.m. My personal phone, not the work line. A number I didn't recognize, but with an area code I did. I answered it because I had been answering unknown numbers more carefully since Soo-yeon had walked into my coffee shop. It was a woman's voice. Older, slightly breathless, the way people sound when they've been passed between phone menus for too long and have finally reached an actual human. Is this the coordinator? For the clinic on Ashland? I paused. The Ashland clinic was one of the 4, the smallest one. The one I had always thought served the most vulnerable population, because its supply needs were the most specific and the most urgent. How did you get this number? The front desk gave it to me. They said to call if it was an emergency. Her voice wavered slightly. My son has been receiving treatment there for 8 months. They told me yesterday that there might be a disruption in his medication supply. I needed to know if it was going to be okay. I closed my eyes for exactly 2 seconds. What's the medication? I asked. She told me. I knew the supply chain for it by memory. I had restructured it personally 6 weeks ago because the original distributor had a reliability problem. The current chain was solid. The disruption she'd been told about was connected to the modifications that had been made 3 days ago. Modifications I had already corrected. It's been resolved, I told her. The disruption was temporary. His supply won't be affected. A pause, then quietly, Thank you. I'm sorry to bother you. You didn't bother me, I said. She hung up. I sat very still at my desk for a long moment, looking at nothing. That phone call did something to the architecture of my thinking that I hadn't anticipated. Not dramatically, not with some sudden revelation, but quietly, the way water finds its level. A woman who didn't know my name or anything about the systems I worked inside had called a number she'd been given and told me her son was receiving treatment he couldn't get anywhere else. And because of work I had done, and rebuilt, and protected, that treatment was going to continue. That was real. That was the most real thing that had happened to me in months. I was still sitting with that thought when Sang-woo appeared in my doorway at 3:15. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He simply appeared, with that quality of having always been about to be there. He looked at me for a moment, reading something in my expression that I hadn't been aware was visible. What happened? He asked. I told him about the phone call. Not all of it, not the emotional weight of it, just the facts. The woman, her son, the question, the answer. He listened without interrupting, which was his default, but there was something different in the quality of his attention. Denser, somehow. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. That clinic treats 43 people currently, he said. Chronic conditions. Most of them have no other options. I hadn't known the number, 43. I looked at him. You know all of them? I know the numbers, he said. The details I leave to the people who manage the care. There it was again. That thing he did where he revealed something without ornamenting it. Just the plain fact, offered without asking for anything in return. He knew the numbers. He kept track. Whatever the organization was built on, whatever it did in the parts of its operation I deliberately didn't examine. This part, the clinics, the 43 people, the medications that couldn't be accessed anywhere else. That part he carried with full awareness. I thought about what Soo-yeon had told me in the coffee shop. It was not a reflection of your work, or of anything else. I thought about how a man who ran an organization capable of making a threat simply ceased to exist, had structured 4 clinics to serve people invisible to the conventional healthcare system. I thought about all the ways I had spent months in this building telling myself I was just doing logistics, just managing supply chains, just staying in my lane. I had been doing something that mattered. And so, In his own irresolvable way, had he. Sangwoo, I said. It was the first time I had used his first name directly, to his face, since I'd learned it. I watched him register it. Barely. Just a fractional shift in his posture. But I had learned to read fractions. I need to say something. And I need you to let me finish before you do whatever it is you do, where you decide something without telling me. A pause. Something that might, in another person, have been the beginning of amusement. Go ahead. I came back because the clinics needed continuity. That was true. But it wasn't the only reason. And I think you know that. And I think I've been working very hard to pretend otherwise because the alternative is acknowledging something that complicates everything. I kept my voice level. I was good at keeping my voice level. I'm not asking you for anything. I'm not making a declaration. I needed to stop pretending I don't feel what I feel. Because pretending takes energy I'd rather spend on things that actually matter. The silence that followed was long enough that I became very aware of the ambient sound of the building, the faint hum of the ventilation system. Somewhere on the floor, a phone ringing twice and stopping. Sangwoo looked at me, really looked, in that way he had that felt like being examined by something that didn't miss details. Then he crossed the room, not quickly, not with any drama, and stopped in front of my desk. Close enough that I had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. He reached out and set something on the desk in front of me. A key card. Plain, unmarked, different from my current one. 22nd floor, he said. Unrestricted. I looked at the key card. Then at him. That's not a response to what I said. Yes, it is, he said. I understood it later. Not in that moment, but later, sitting in my car in the parking garage, turning the key card over in my hands. He didn't have a language for what I had said. Or rather, he had a language, and it wasn't made of words. It was made of access and proximity, and the quiet, permanent fact of you are not going anywhere and neither am I, expressed through a key card to a floor he had never given anyone outside his most trusted circle. That was, for Sangwoo, everything. The weeks that followed were different in a way I find hard to describe from the inside. Not dramatic. Not the way you'd expect, if you were imagining the story from the outside. There was no single moment where everything changed and announced itself. It was more like the gradual accumulation of small constants. The coffee that kept appearing on my desk. The way he positioned himself between me and doors when we were in rooms with people he didn't fully trust. The way his men had stopped pretending their proximity to me was coincidental. Once, I was in an elevator with 3 people I didn't know, heading to a meeting, and Sangwoo stepped in at the last second. He stood beside me, not touching, not speaking, just there. The 3 other people adjusted their positions by a collective 8 inches without seeming to notice they'd done it. I noticed. I kept my face forward and felt the warmth of him beside me and said nothing. When we stepped out on 22, he fell into step beside me, and for just a moment, his hand brushed the small of my back. Barely contact, barely anything, the lightest possible pressure. And then it was gone, and he was 3 feet ahead of me, already in the room, already the center of something. I stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second, reorganizing myself. Then I walked in and sat down and did my job. There's a version of this story where I tell you I found a clean way to reconcile all of it. The nature of the organization, the things I chose not to ask about. The particular moral geometry of working inside something that operated outside conventional law, while also providing care to 43 people who had no other options. I want to be honest. I didn't find a clean reconciliation. I found a livable one. Those aren't the same thing, and I know the difference. What I found, more precisely, was this. I was not the same person I had been when I walked into the Meridian Tower for the first time. Key card in a plain envelope, not knowing what I was walking into. That woman had been competent and careful and thoroughly protected by the walls of her own professionalism. She had been safe in the way that people are safe when nothing has required them to be otherwise. I was still competent, still careful, but the walls were different now. Not lower exactly, but permeable in specific places. Places that had names I had stopped refusing to use. On a Friday evening in late April, I was finishing up on the 22nd floor when I realized the building had gone quiet around me. I packed my bag and walked to the elevator, and when the doors opened, Sang-woo was there, not on his phone this time, just standing, hands in the pockets of his jacket, looking at nothing until I stepped in. The doors closed. 14 floors of silence, which had become over months a very specific kind of conversation. At the 9th floor, without looking at me, he said, "You rebuilt the North Side chain again." "The third distributor was showing reliability flags," I said. "I rerouted before it became a problem." "I know." A pause. "I read your documentation." I glanced at him. "You read my documentation?" "I read everything that moves through this organization." The elevator opened on the lobby. Neither of us moved for exactly 1 second, a second that had the particular weight of something being silently decided. And then we both stepped out, and he held the lobby door for me, and we walked out into the Chicago evening together. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't say anything else. He simply walked beside me in the cooling air, close enough that our arms nearly touched, his men trailing at a respectful distance behind us, the city moving all around us the way cities do, indifferent, relentless, full of its own noise. I had come into this building as a woman who made herself invisible in order to be necessary. I was leaving it on a Friday evening beside a man who had turned his entire organization inside out to keep me from being seen by the wrong people, who expressed care through key cards and rerouted supply chains, and the warm, permanent pressure of simply being beside me without explanation or apology. I didn't need it to be louder than that. I had learned his language. For the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I felt entirely like myself. Not a smaller version, not a careful version, but the full and actual thing. The city opened up ahead of us, and I walked into it without looking back.